When we think about the downfall of Nazi Germany during World War II, we often picture the vast battles on the Eastern Front, the brutal air raids over German cities, or the desperate attempts by the Allies to break through Nazi defenses. However, there is one critical factor that played a significant, often overlooked role in Germany's eventual defeat: a crippling fuel shortage. The lack of fuel was not just a minor inconvenience. It was a strategic disaster that profoundly affected Germany's military capabilities. In this video, we will explore how the fuel crisis unfolded, why it became so dire, and how it directly contributed to Germany's inability to win the war. Before we dive into the specifics of the fuel crisis, it's crucial to understand why fuel was so vital during World War II for Nazi Germany. Fuel was the lifeblood of their military operations. From the blitzkrieg tactics that depended on rapid mobility of tanks and trucks to the Luftwaffe's air superiority, fuel was required to keep the military machinery running. Oil, in particular, was essential. It powered tanks, trucks, aircraft, and even the Nazi warships. Without it, the entire Nazi war effort was jeopardized. The ability to supply and maintain a steady flow of fuel was crucial for sustaining offensive operations and maintaining troop mobility across the vast territories that Germany sought to conquer. However, as the war dragged on, Germany found itself facing a series of supply shortages. This wasn't due to a lack of effort or planning, but rather the reality of the global war environment. Germany had one major problem. It was almost entirely dependent on foreign oil sources. Germany, unlike the United States or the Soviet Union, did not have the vast natural oil reserves necessary to fuel its war machine. Prior to the war, Germany imported much of its oil from countries like Romania, which held significant oil fields in Ploiesti. The situation worsened as the war progressed and Germany found itself cut off from these critical supplies. Germany's dependence on foreign oil sources made it extremely vulnerable to Allied attacks. The more the Allies advanced, the more Germany's access to oil was restricted, especially after the Axis powers failed to capture key oil fields in the Soviet Union, most notably in the Caucasus. As early as 1942, the Allies were aware of the strategic importance of oil to Germany's war effort, and they began to target oil refineries and transport routes. Despite efforts to secure alternative sources and even develop synthetic oil through coal liquefaction, the shortage of fuel began to take its toll. As the war entered its critical phases, the lack of fuel began to seriously hinder the effectiveness of the German military. By 1943, it was becoming clear that the fuel shortage was no longer a peripheral issue but a fundamental problem. The Germans, despite their technological innovations and military prowess, found themselves grappling with logistical nightmares that their enemies could exploit. To understand the extent of the fuel crisis, we need to look at how the shortage impacted Germany's major military campaigns. One of the first and most noticeable effects was the decline in the mobility of their forces. Blitzkrieg, the very tactic that had brought them so much success in the early years of the war, was dependent on rapid coordinated attacks involving tanks, trucks, and aircraft. As fuel supplies dwindled, these fast-moving assaults became far less effective. For instance, during the Battle of Kursk in 1943, one of the largest tank battles in history, the Germans faced significant mobility issues due to fuel shortages. The German forces were unable to carry out the rapid, overwhelming assaults they had used so effectively in the past. Instead, their tanks and trucks had to move more slowly, allowing the Soviet forces to better counter their advances. The result was a crushing defeat for Germany, with a staggering loss of men and equipment, and a pivotal moment in the Eastern Front. Similarly, on the Western Front, the Allied forces began to notice the growing mobility problems of the German army. After the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the Allies pushed rapidly across France, and German forces struggled to keep up. The lack of fuel meant that the Germans could not mount a sustained counterattack, even though they had numerical superiority in certain areas. This inability to respond effectively was a key factor in the Allies' ability to secure territory and push deeper into Germany. The Luftwaffe too was severely affected by the fuel shortage. At the height of their power, the Germans had been able to use their air superiority to support ground operations, interdict supply lines, and strike at Allied forces. However, as the war progressed and fuel became scarcer, the Luftwaffe's operational range diminished. They could no longer provide close air support to their ground forces in the same way, and their ability to defend German territory against Allied bombing raids was severely compromised. One of the most significant examples of how the lack of fuel affected German strategy was the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944. This was the last major German offensive on the Western Front, and it was intended to split the Allied forces and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The Germans launched the attack with a significant force of tanks and infantry, but they were unable to maintain momentum due to fuel shortages. German tanks and trucks stalled along the roads, and as the weather cleared, the Allies were able to counterattack effectively. The fuel shortage made it impossible for the Germans to achieve the surprise and speed necessary to win. Meanwhile, the Allies were actively targeting Germany's oil infrastructure. Strategic bombing raids, such as the devastating attacks on the Ploiesti oil fields in Romania and the synthetic fuel plants in Germany, were designed to cripple the German war effort. These raids were part of a broader strategy to strangle the Nazi regime by cutting off its access to vital resources. The synthetic fuel plants, though an impressive technical achievement, were not immune to these attacks. Despite the Germans' ability to produce fuel from coal, the process was inefficient and costly, and the plants were vulnerable to Allied bombings. After a series of air raids in 1944 and 1945, many of these plants were destroyed or severely damaged. This only exacerbated the fuel shortage and further diminished Germany's capacity to fight the war. As the Allies closed in on Germany from both the east and the west, the fuel shortage became more pronounced. In the final stages of the war, the German military was reduced to using whatever fuel it could scrounge from captured territories. In some cases, fuel was so scarce that tanks and trucks had to be abandoned, and soldiers were forced to fight without the mobility they had once relied on. This lack of fuel made it nearly impossible for the Germans to conduct coordinated large-scale operations. Instead, they were relegated to fighting piecemeal battles, which were icily exploited by the Allies. By the time of Germany's surrender in May 1945, the fuel shortage had reached a crisis point. Germany's military, which had once been a formidable force capable of rapid, decisive attacks, was now crippled by its inability to maintain a functioning supply chain for fuel. Without fuel, the German war effort was no longer sustainable, and their ability to defend against the advancing Allied forces had been severely compromised. As the war dragged on, the fuel crisis in Germany became intertwined with the broader strategic collapse of the Third Reich. The lack of fuel, combined with the failure to secure vital resources and the depletion of their industrial capacity, gradually turned the tide of war against Germany. But perhaps one of the most profound consequences of the fuel shortage was the direct effect it had on Germany, its ability to maintain effective warfare across multiple fronts. Germany's original war plan relied heavily on the concept of strategic resource acquisition. This was particularly true for oil, which was necessary not only for fuel, but also for the production of lubricants, chemicals, and synthetic materials used in the manufacturing of war machinery. Without control over significant oil reserves, Germany's military was always at a disadvantage in terms of logistical sustainability. The loss of access to vital oil reserves began early in the war. In 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union with the aim of securing the vast oil fields of the Caucasus region. These fields were seen as crucial to sustaining the German war machine. However, the failure of the Germans to capture these fields, combined with the protracted and costly nature of the Eastern Front, meant that their oil supply lines remained tenuous. The inability to capitalize on the Soviet Union's oil wealth would haunt Germany throughout the rest of the war. Even as the Germans advanced into Soviet territory, they found themselves facing an increasingly mobile and determined enemy. As the war progressed, the Soviets began to systematically target German supply lines and oil reserves, further reducing Germany's access to fuel. In fact, the oil fields that Germany had hoped to capture were not only defended by Soviet forces but were also sabotaged to deny the Germans their use. The loss of access to these resources led to the Germans' reliance on synthetic oil production. Early in the war, Germany had invested heavily in developing methods to convert coal into oil, a process known as the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. This method allowed Germany to produce some of its fuel needs, but the scale and efficiency were limited. By 1943, as the Allies stepped up their bombing campaigns, many of the synthetic oil plants were targeted and destroyed. Despite the German efforts to keep these facilities operational, the bombings significantly reduced their production capacity, further worsening the fuel shortage. By the time the Allies launched their strategic bombing campaigns against Germany's synthetic oil plants, they had already developed the means to strike at these critical sites with devastating precision. The American and British bombers systematically destroyed much of Germany's oil infrastructure, including facilities like the synthetic oil plant at Ploiesti in Romania, which was a key source of fuel. These air raids, along with the destruction of the German oil refineries, disrupted the flow of fuel to the front lines. One of the most telling signs of Germany's struggle to sustain its military efforts due to fuel shortages was its inability to conduct meaningful offensives in the latter half of the war. The Germans were forced to operate on a shoestring fuel budget, often having to choose between maintaining their tanks, aircraft, or supply trucks. This created a situation where their armed forces were often operating at reduced capacity, struggling to carry out even basic maneuvers. In the war's final years, the Allies began to gain a greater understanding of the importance of disrupting Germany's fuel supply, which had become an Achilles heel. The strategic bombing raids were relentless, targeting not only military infrastructure but also the industrial facilities that supported the war effort. In this way, the fuel shortage directly contributed to the breakdown of Germany's military capability, leading to a situation where, despite having vast resources and manpower at their disposal, the German forces could not sustain prolonged military action. Germany's desperation to address the fuel crisis led them to attempt some drastic measures. One of the most infamous and controversial strategies was the creation of the so-called Volkssturm, or People's Storm, which involved arming civilians and using them as a last-ditch defense against the Allies. However, this desperate measure did little to address the core issue of the fuel shortage and only served to highlight the extent of Germany's decline. At the same time, the Germans were forced to rely on more primitive and less efficient forms of fuel. In the final stages of the war, as oil reserves ran dry, the Germans experimented with converting vehicles to run on wood gas, a process that involved using wood chips to generate gas that could be burned as fuel. While this solution provided some limited relief, it was a stopgap measure that could not solve the larger problem. As the Allies closed in from both the east and the west, the reality of the fuel shortage became all the more apparent. German forces, already spread thin and demoralized, found themselves unable to resist the overwhelming force of the Allied advances. The fuel crisis, in combination with other strategic blunders, ensured that Germany's military could no longer mount an effective defense. The collapse of the German war machine was not just the result of a few isolated factors. It was the culmination of a series of failures, strategic, logistical, and industrial. The inability to secure sufficient fuel supplies was one of the most crucial factors in this collapse. It is a testament to the importance of logistics in modern warfare and how the lack of a single resource fuel can undermine even the most powerful military forces. As Germany faced mounting challenges on the battlefield, the Allied forces continued to press their advantage. By 1944, the Allies had gained significant control of the airspace over Germany, making it increasingly difficult for the Germans to defend their fuel infrastructure. The relentless Allied air raids, particularly by the United States Army Air Forces (USAF), crippled Germany's oil refineries, factories, and synthetic fuel plants. This not only limited the production of fuel but also disrupted the transportation networks necessary to distribute it to the front lines. The Luftwaffe, once a formidable force in the early years of the war, was now forced to divert its remaining fuel supplies to defend German airspace against Allied bombers. The shortage of fuel for the Luftwaffe meant that German planes were often unable to provide adequate air support for ground operations, further weakening the German military's ability to fight on multiple fronts. The inability to maintain air superiority became one of the defining factors that contributed to Germany's eventual defeat. As the Allies advanced from both the east and the west, the fuel crisis in Germany reached its peak. By the winter of 1944-1945, Germany's fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. The final German offensives, including the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, were hampered by a lack of fuel. Despite the initial success of the German surprise attack, the advancing Allied forces quickly regained control, and the inability to fuel their vehicles, tanks, and aircraft rendered the German forces ineffective. The shortage of fuel prevented the Germans from launching sustained offensives or properly resupplying their troops, sealing their fate. In addition to the strategic consequences of the fuel shortage, the lack of fuel also had a profound impact on the everyday lives of the German civilian population. As the war progressed, the German government imposed strict rationing on fuel, and transportation networks were severely disrupted. Civilian cars, trucks, and trains were given limited access to fuel, and people were forced to rely on alternative means of transportation, including bicycles and horse-drawn carts. The shortages affected all aspects of life, from food distribution to the production of consumer goods, as the entire German economy became increasingly centered around the war effort. By the time of the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, it was clear that Germany's fuel situation was dire. Despite the Germans' attempts to adapt to the fuel crisis, including the development of alternative energy sources and the reallocation of fuel from civilian use to military operations, these measures were too little, too late. The Allies had gained significant momentum, and the German military was simply unable to maintain the pace of the conflict. The shortage of fuel was not just a logistical problem, it was a strategic vulnerability that undermined Germany's entire war effort. In the final months of the war, as the Soviet army pushed into Eastern Europe and the Western Allies advanced from the west, Germany was effectively surrounded. The inability to fuel its military machines, combined with the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Allies, left Germany with little hope of turning the tide. The fuel shortage had crippled Germany's ability to wage war on a scale that was required to fight a global conflict. What had once been an aggressive and well-coordinated military force was now reduced to a desperate, fragmented remnant, clinging to any remaining resources it could find. In the end, the fuel shortage became a defining characteristic of the German defeat in World War II. It demonstrated the importance of logistics and resource management in modern warfare and the catastrophic consequences of not securing vital resources. Germany's inability to secure and maintain a steady supply of oil not only hampered its ability to wage war effectively but also contributed to its strategic collapse. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the world would learn a painful lesson about the importance of resource management and warfare. The fuel shortage that had crippled the Nazi war effort would become a critical topic of study for military strategists and historians. as it highlighted how the failure to secure vital resources can be just as decisive in war as military strategy, tactics, and technology. In fact, it is often said that wars are won not just by the armies that fight them but by the industries and resources that support them. In Germany's case, the failure to secure a reliable supply of fuel was a key factor in its downfall. As the Allies began to rebuild Europe after the war, the importance of securing energy resources became even more evident. The global balance of power shifted in the post-war era, and nations began to understand that control over vital resources like oil could make the difference between victory and defeat. The oil crises that would later plague the world in the 1970s were, in many ways, a reflection of the lessons learned from Germany's failed attempts to sustain its military and industrial infrastructure during World War II. The fuel shortage crisis in Germany was not just a momentary setback, it was a defining feature of the collapse of the Third Reich. It was the final straw that broke the back of an already overextended and crumbling war machine. For Germany, the inability to maintain a steady supply of fuel was a strategic mistake that contributed significantly to its defeat. The lessons from this crisis remain relevant today, as nations continue to grapple with the role of resources and logistics in modern conflicts. The strategic importance of fuel in warfare, as demonstrated by Germany's downfall in World War II, cannot be overstated. Fuel was the lifeblood of military operations, and without it, even the most technologically advanced army becomes immobilized. The fuel shortage in Germany not only hindered military operations but also exposed the vulnerabilities in its war strategy, which had initially been built on rapid mechanized warfare. As the war progressed and Germany faced increased pressure from the Allied forces, it became clear that its reliance on a limited and increasingly stretched fuel supply would be its undoing. One of the earliest signs of the looming fuel crisis in Germany came in 1941 with the failed invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June of that year, was an ambitious campaign aimed at capturing the Soviet Union's vast oil fields in the Caucasus region. The Germans believed that by securing this vital resource, they would be able to sustain their war machine and potentially cripple the Soviet Union's ability to resist. However, the Germans vastly underestimated the logistical challenges involved in such an operation, and their advance stalled long before they could reach the oil fields. The failure of Operation Barbarossa had far-reaching consequences for Germany. Not only did it fail to capture the much-needed oil reserves, but it also left the German military overextended and vulnerable. As the war in the East dragged on, the Germans were forced to rely on synthetic fuel production. But this effort was never able to meet the full demands of the Wehrmacht. The synthetic fuel plants, such as those in the Ruhr Valley, were constantly under threat from Allied air raids, which limited their output and made the German military more dependent on supplies from occupied territories. This created a vicious cycle of over-reliance on limited resources and vulnerability to attack. The importance of oil as a strategic asset became even more apparent during the Battle of Stalingrad, which began in the summer of 1942. By this time, Germany's need for fuel had become critical, as the Wehrmacht was deep in Soviet territory and needed a constant supply of fuel to keep its tanks, trucks, and aircraft operational. The Germans attempted to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus, but they were stopped by Soviet resistance, and the battle turned into a protracted siege. The failure to secure the oil fields, combined with the logistical challenges of supplying the front lines, contributed to Germany's eventual defeat. The battle was a turning point in the war, and the loss marked the beginning of a series of defeats that would ultimately lead to Germany's surrender. The fuel shortage issue was compounded by the Germans' failure to secure alternative sources of energy. In the early years of the war, Germany's synthetic fuel program had been seen as a potential solution to its reliance on imported oil. The process, known as the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, allowed the Germans to convert coal into liquid fuel. While this technology was a technological marvel, it had significant limitations. The amount of coal needed to produce a given amount of fuel was enormous, and the process was inefficient compared to natural oil production. Moreover, the synthetic fuel plants were vulnerable to Allied bombing raids, which reduced their capacity and further exacerbated the fuel crisis. Despite these challenges, Germany continued to pursue alternative fuel sources throughout the war. In 1943, the Germans began experimenting with synthetic rubber and alternative fuels derived from agricultural products, but these efforts were too little, too late. By this time, the Allies had gained control of the air and were systematically destroying Germany's industrial infrastructure. The relentless Allied bombing campaigns, combined with the ongoing fuel shortages, made it increasingly difficult for Germany to maintain its military operations. The result was a crippling scarcity of fuel that further weakened the German war effort. As the Allies closed in on Germany in 1944 and 1945, the situation became even more dire. The German military had no choice but to abandon many of its frontline positions and retreat into its own territory. The once proud Wehrmacht, which had been a symbol of German military might, was now a broken and demoralized force, crippled by the fuel shortages and the overwhelming Allied assault. The inability to fuel its vehicles, tanks, An aircraft made it impossible for the Germans to defend themselves effectively, and their defeat became inevitable. The Battle of the Bulge, fought in December 1944, was one of the last desperate attempts by Germany to turn the tide of the war. The German High Command launched a surprise offensive in the Ardennes region of Belgium, hoping to break through the Allied lines and gain a strategic advantage. However, the lack of fuel was a decisive factor in the failure of this operation. The Germans were unable to sustain their offensive and were quickly pushed back by the Allied forces. The shortage of fuel meant that German tanks and vehicles could not keep up with the pace of the attack, and the offensive stalled before it could achieve its objectives. The Battle of the Bulge was one of the final blows to Germany's war effort and demonstrated just how critical fuel was to military success. By the time the Soviet Red Army reached Berlin in April 1945, the situation was beyond repair. The German military was in full retreat, and the civilian population was suffering from the effects of prolonged war and scarcity. The lack of fuel had not only destroyed Germany's military capability but had also taken a heavy toll on its economy and infrastructure. The German population faced widespread shortages of food, fuel, and other essential goods, and the country's once thriving industrial base lay in ruins. In the aftermath of the war, the lessons of Germany's fuel shortage became clear. The importance of securing reliable sources of energy had been tragically underestimated, and the inability to do so had been a major factor in the collapse of the Third Reich. The fuel crisis that had crippled Germany during the war would go down in history as a key element in the country's defeat, and the strategic significance of fuel would continue to shape military thinking for decades to come. As Germany's fuel crisis deepened, the strategic decisions made by the Nazi leadership only exacerbated their already precarious position. One of the most significant missteps was the failure to adapt their war strategy to the reality of their fuel shortages. The German High Command, under Adolf Hitler, continued to push for ambitious offensives even as their supply lines grew thinner and their reserves dwindled. This was particularly evident during the later stages of the war, where instead of focusing on defensive strategies that could conserve resources, the Germans launched ill-fated offensives like the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge, one of the largest and bloodiest battles fought by the Germans during World War II, exemplified the devastating consequences of this strategic overreach. Hitler's plan was to split the Allied forces and capture the vital Belgian port city of Antwerp, which would disrupt the Allies' supply lines and buy Germany valuable time. However, the Germans did not have the fuel reserves necessary to sustain such an operation. The offensive was launched in the freezing cold of winter, and the Germans quickly found themselves bogged down in the snow and mud, unable to keep their tanks and vehicles moving without a steady supply of fuel. The Allies, despite being initially surprised by the attack, responded quickly, and the Germans' inability to maintain momentum soon became clear. The lack of fuel prevented the Germans from properly coordinating their forces, and they were unable to fully capitalize on their initial success. The offensive eventually faltered, with the Allies pushing the Germans back and ultimately defeating them. The Battle of the Bulge marked the end of the German hopes for any meaningful victories on the Western Front and was a clear example of how fuel shortages crippled their military capacity. Simultaneously, the Allied forces were fully aware of Germany's fuel vulnerability and sought to exploit it at every opportunity. Strategic bombing campaigns aimed at destroying Germany's fuel production facilities were a key part of the Allied strategy from as early as 1942. The U.S. Army Air Force, working alongside the Royal Air Force, focused their bombing efforts on the synthetic fuel plants in Germany and the occupied territories. One of the most significant targets was the synthetic fuel plant at Luna, located in the heart of the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial hub. This plant was responsible for producing a significant portion of the fuel used by the German military. The Allies understood that knocking out Germany's synthetic fuel capabilities would bring the German war effort to a standstill. Bombing raids intensified throughout 1943 and 1944, and the damage done to these facilities was severe. By late 1944, the synthetic fuel production was operating at a fraction of its pre-war capacity, and it became clear that Germany's military operations could not continue without a reliable fuel source. The Allies' relentless air campaign had effectively crippled the German war machine. Yet, despite the ever-growing pressure from the Allies and the worsening fuel situation, the German leadership continued to cling to unrealistic hopes of victory. Hitler, in particular, stubbornly refused to alter his plans, even as the fuel crisis became a critical factor in every battle. The failure to acknowledge this limitation led to disastrous strategic decisions, which ultimately led to the collapse of the German war effort. The Germans' inability to secure sufficient fuel was not just a logistical problem, it was a systemic failure that permeated every aspect of their military strategy. From the initial overextension of their forces in the Soviet Union to the ill-fated offensives in Western Europe, fuel shortages were an ever-present issue as the war dragged on. The scarcity of fuel exacerbated Germany's strategic mistakes, and their military, once the most formidable in Europe, became a shadow of its former self. The impact of the fuel shortage also had significant consequences for the German economy. As the war progressed, The Allies' bombing campaigns targeted not only military infrastructure but also industrial centers, including oil refineries, factories, and transportation hubs. This compounded the problems faced by Germany's economy as production rates dropped and civilian morale plummeted. The civilian population was subjected to rationing, and shortages of fuel, food, and other essential goods became widespread. With much of the country's infrastructure destroyed and fuel in short supply, the German workforce found it increasingly difficult to maintain the war effort. Industrial production fell sharply, and the civilian population suffered from dire shortages. While the Nazi regime had attempted to maintain a facade of strength and unity, the reality on the ground was one of desperate deprivation. The fuel crisis made it all but impossible for Germany to continue its war economy, which was based on the continuous output of war material, transportation of resources, and maintenance of military operations. The inability to fuel the German military machine meant that, as the Allies closed in from both the east and the west, Germany's defense forces were unable to mount a cohesive resistance. By the time Soviet forces reached Berlin in 1945, the German military had been shattered by a combination of logistical failures, fuel shortages, and the overwhelming pressure of two fronts. The once mighty Wehrmacht had been reduced to a desperate, retreating force, its resources completely exhausted. In addition to the military failures, the fuel shortage had political repercussions as well. The German population, already disillusioned by years of war, began to lose faith in the Nazi leadership as the situation deteriorated. The lack of basic necessities, including fuel for heating and transportation, added to the growing sense of discontent among the German people. This discontent would eventually contribute to the collapse of the Nazi regime, as the reality of their situation became inescapable. In the final months of the war, even as German leadership clung to a vain hope of a miraculous turnaround, the Allies continued to press their advantage. The Red Army's advance into Berlin was unstoppable, and the American and British forces pushed the Germans back on the Western Front. The fuel shortage had rendered Germany incapable of mounting any significant resistance, and on May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. The consequences of the fuel shortage in Germany were far-reaching and played a crucial role in the outcome of World War II. While many factors contributed to the Allied victory, the inability of Germany to secure a steady supply of fuel was a critical vulnerability that, over time, proved impossible to overcome. Fuel, which had been one of the key factors in Germany's early successes, became a decisive factor in its ultimate defeat. The story of the German fuel crisis is a stark reminder of how vital energy resources are in modern warfare and how their scarcity can lead to the downfall of even the most powerful nations. As the war came to a close, the devastating effects of Germany's fuel crisis were felt across the entirety of the European theater. The German military's inability to sustain its operations due to the lack of fuel directly contributed to the rapid disintegration of its defense capabilities. But this crisis was not solely the result of the Allies' bombing campaigns or the inevitable depletion of reserves. There were also significant strategic miscalculations and inefficiencies in the German leadership's handling of resources that played a key role. One of the fundamental issues was the German reliance on synthetic fuel production. At the outbreak of World War II, Germany had very few natural oil reserves and thus had to rely heavily on synthetic fuel produced through coal liquefaction and other processes. The Germans invested heavily in this technology, building massive refineries and chemical plants designed to produce fuel from coal, which was abundant in Germany and the occupied territories. However, while these synthetic fuels provided a degree of self-sufficiency, they were never a perfect substitute for crude oil, and the quality and quantity of the fuel produced were often inconsistent. The synthetic fuel plants were particularly vulnerable to Allied air raids, which became more frequent and devastating as the war progressed. By 1943, the Allies had identified the synthetic fuel plants as key targets, and a series of bombing raids severely disrupted Germany's fuel production capabilities. These attacks targeted plants like the ones at Luna, Buna, and Plitz, which were among the largest and most important sources of fuel for the Wehrmacht. The relentless bombing campaigns, combined with the scarcity of raw materials and the inability to maintain a steady flow of supplies, led to a dramatic decline in fuel production. By the time the Allies launched their final offensive in 1944, the synthetic fuel plants were operating at only a fraction of their capacity. As the situation worsened, the Germans resorted to increasingly desperate measures in an attempt to conserve fuel and prolong the war effort. One of the more notable strategies was the emphasis on autarky, the pursuit of complete economic self-sufficiency. To achieve this, Germany sought to extract oil from unconventional sources, including the Balkans and the Soviet Union. The German forces made an ill-fated attempt to seize the oil-rich Caucasus region in southern Russia, but this proved disastrous. The Battle for the Caucasus, which took place in 1942, was one of the key turning points of the war, and the Germans were unable to secure the oil fields they so desperately needed. The failure to capture these vital resources not only led to the loss of valuable fuel supplies, but also exposed the limitations of Germany's strategic planning. The fuel crisis also had a profound impact on the morale of the German military. Soldiers and officers alike were acutely aware of the shortage, and it led to a significant decline in their fighting spirit. While the German military had been highly disciplined and motivated in the early years of the war, the constant strain of fighting on multiple fronts, coupled with the growing realization that the war could not be won, had a demoralizing effect. The inability to keep vehicles and tanks fueled meant that the Wehrmacht's once formidable mobility was drastically reduced. The German forces, known for their blitzkrieg tactics, fast-moving mobile warfare, were now bogged down in static battles where fuel was the limiting factor. This shift in warfare dynamics had far-reaching consequences. The German military, once renowned for its speed and agility, was now forced to adopt defensive strategies that were out of step with the offensive tactics that had previously been so successful. The inability to move quickly and respond flexibly to changing situations allowed the Allies to gain the upper hand. The Germans, despite their superior training and equipment in many cases, were increasingly outmaneuvered by the Allied forces, who had a much more reliable supply of fuel and could sustain their operations over long distances. The impact on the civilian population was equally severe. While the German military struggled to maintain its operations, the average German citizen faced the brunt of the fuel shortage on the home front. Rationing became increasingly severe, and transportation for both civilians and military personnel was severely restricted. The lack of fuel meant that trains, buses, and cars could not operate at full capacity, making it harder for people to get to work, acquire food, or even evacuate when necessary. The situation became especially dire in the final months of the war, as bombings and fuel shortages disrupted every aspect of daily life. One particularly striking example of this hardship was the transportation of food and supplies to the civilian population. The German war economy relied heavily on the transportation of goods by rail, but by late 1944, the lack of fuel meant that even this basic function was severely hindered. The lack of fuel also had a direct impact on the German industrial base, as factories could not operate without a steady supply of energy. This further compounded the difficulties faced by the military, as they were unable to produce the weapons, ammunition, and supplies necessary for prolonged combat. In the final stages of the war, even the German leadership began to recognize that victory was impossible without access to sufficient fuel. However, it was too little, too late. The Germans had already squandered their resources in a futile attempt to sustain their military ambitions. And by the time they were facing the full brunt of the Allied onslaught, they had no way of replenishing their fuel reserves. The consequences of the fuel shortage were now being felt on every front, and the German war effort collapsed under the weight of its own logistical failures. By the time of Germany's surrender in May 1945, the fuel crisis had reached its peak. The Allies, having successfully implemented strategic bombing campaigns and a comprehensive blockade, had effectively cut off Germany's access to the resources necessary for continued warfare. The German military, exhausted and undermined by years of fuel shortages, could no longer mount a meaningful resistance. The collapse of the Third Reich, in many ways, was sealed not by military defeat alone, but by the failure of the German fuel supply system. The fuel shortage faced by Germany during World War II stands as one of the most significant examples in history of how a nation's ability to sustain its military efforts is directly linked to its access to energy resources. It serves as a stark reminder of the critical role that fuel plays in modern warfare, and how its scarcity can cripple even the most powerful of nations. Had Germany secured the fuel necessary to maintain its war effort, the course of the war might have been very different. But the reality was that, in the end, it was the lack of fuel, not just the strength of the Allied forces, that led to Germany's ultimate defeat. As we reflect on the fuel shortage that ultimately crippled Germany's ability to wage war effectively, it's important to understand how deeply the German military's strategic decisions were shaped by their need for oil and fuel. The shortage not only affected their tactical operations but also influenced broader strategic choices made by the Nazi leadership. The impact of the fuel crisis can be seen most clearly in key battles, where the failure to secure and sustain fuel supplies was a decisive factor. Take, for instance, the famous Battle of Stalingrad, which began in the summer of 1942. The German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, had advanced deep into Soviet territory with the goal of capturing the strategic city of Stalingrad. The city itself held symbolic and strategic importance, but the most critical factor for the Germans was the access it offered to vital oil fields in the Caucasus region. These oil fields were an integral part of Germany's plan to solve its fuel crisis. However, as the battle dragged on, the German forces found themselves bogged down in urban warfare, unable to advance or retreat effectively due to a lack of fuel. The German military's supply lines were stretched thin, and their vehicles, tanks, trucks, and aircraft could no longer operate at full capacity. As the encirclement of the German Sixth Army unfolded, it became clear that the battle was lost not just due to Soviet resistance, but because the German forces were unable to move their armored divisions, resupply their troops, or conduct effective air support, all of which relied on a steady flow of fuel. By the time the encirclement was complete, the German forces were forced into a desperate and ultimately disastrous attempt to hold out without the necessary fuel to continue the fight. In other theaters of war, the fuel crisis had equally far-reaching consequences. In North Africa, the German Afrika Korps under General Erwin Rommel was unable to sustain its operations for similar reasons. Rommel's forces advanced across the vast desert, but their ability to maintain momentum was severely hindered by a lack of fuel. The Axis forces struggled to supply their troops and vehicles, especially after the Allies established control over vital supply routes in the Mediterranean. The fight for oil was a driving force behind the campaign, and the inability to secure these crucial resources led to the eventual defeat of Rommel's forces. This was yet another example of how Germany's reliance on a limited and increasingly unreliable fuel supply undermined its military efforts. As the war entered its later stages, the Germans tried to compensate for their lack of fuel with strategic innovation. One of the more ambitious projects was the development of jet-powered aircraft, such as the Messerschmitt Me-262. These cutting-edge fighters were faster and more powerful than their piston-engine counterparts, but they were extremely fuel-intensive. The fuel required to operate these advanced aircraft was not only scarce, but the production of high-quality fuel for jet engines became an ever-increasing challenge. By the time the Me-262 saw significant deployment in late 1944, it was already too late to turn the tide of the war, and the aircraft's fuel requirements could not be fully met. The Germans also sought to increase the efficiency of their fuel consumption. One of the most notorious examples of this was the use of synthetic fuel, but as mentioned earlier, these plants were vulnerable to bombing raids. To make matters worse, the plants themselves were not operating at full capacity due to inefficiencies and the inability to acquire necessary raw materials. Even with the expansion of synthetic fuel production, the Germans were unable to meet the demands of their military forces. In the final years of the war, Germany's once formidable military machine had become increasingly reliant on an unstable, dwindling supply of synthetic fuel, leaving the German army severely handicapped. By 1944, the situation had reached a breaking point. The Allies, recognizing the importance of fuel in the German war effort, had begun to target fuel depots and transportation hubs with greater frequency. Strategic bombing campaigns aimed at crippling Germany's oil and fuel infrastructure were now at the forefront of Allied military operations. The Ploiesti oil fields in Romania, which supplied a significant portion of Germany's oil, were also targeted by the Allies. Despite German efforts to defend and fortify these areas, the damage inflicted on these oil reserves and refineries was significant, leaving Germany with a severe shortage of fuel by the time of the D-Day landings in June 1944. The situation worsened as Allied forces advanced into German-occupied territories. Fuel shortages were one of the most significant logistical challenges for the Wehrmacht during its retreat from France and the Low Countries. German forces had to abandon large quantities of equipment and vehicles, as they simply could not be powered. The retreat became a chaotic and disorganized scramble to salvage what little was left, with the fuel crisis exacerbating the difficulties of an already overextended military. But it wasn't just the military that was affected. The German civilian population was increasingly forced to endure the realities of life under a fuel-starved regime. With the war raging on all fronts, the Nazi government had to prioritize military needs over civilian ones, leading to severe shortages of fuel for the domestic market. This had a cascading effect on transportation and industry, further disrupting the already fragile German economy. Cities that had once been centers of industrial production were now barely able to keep their lights on, let alone keep up with the demands of wartime manufacturing. The effects of the fuel shortage were also felt in the air, as the Luftwaffe found itself unable to maintain the sort of air superiority that had been critical in earlier phases of the war. The Luftwaffe, which had once been a dominant force in Europe, was now unable to keep up with the growing Allied air power. While the Allies had established near-total air superiority by 1944, the German Air Force struggled to keep planes in the sky due to a lack of fuel and an inability to produce the necessary materials for aircraft maintenance. This was compounded by the increasing difficulty in recruiting and training pilots, many of whom had already been lost in previous campaigns. As the final months of the war unfolded, the Germans found themselves increasingly isolated, their fuel reserves exhausted, and their ability to fight dwindling. The rapid advance of the Allied forces in the west, coupled with the Soviet offensive in the east, left the Germans with no strategic options. The lack of fuel meant that the Wehrmacht could no longer mount an effective defense, and by the spring of 1945, Germany was in a state of collapse. In the end, Germany's fuel crisis proved to be one of the most critical factors in its defeat. While the Allies' military superiority, strategic planning, and coordination certainly played a major role in bringing the Third Reich to its knees, it was the German inability to maintain a steady supply of fuel, whether for its tanks, aircraft, trucks, or even its civilian economy, that played an undeniable and decisive role in the collapse of Nazi Germany. The lesson from this is clear. In modern warfare, control of fuel and energy resources is as vital as any weapon or soldier on the front lines. Germany's failure to secure and maintain its fuel supplies was a fatal flaw that could not be overcome, no matter how advanced its technology or how dedicated its military. As we reach the conclusion of this analysis, it is clear that Germany's fuel shortage crisis was not a simple logistical problem, but a critical vulnerability that directly impacted their ability to wage war on all fronts. The ambitious plans for territorial expansion, the drive for oil-rich regions, and the overextension of German forces all exacerbated their dependency on fuel, making them more vulnerable as the war progressed. The fuel shortage wasn't an isolated issue. It was a systemic failure that intertwined with Germany's strategic overreach. From their ill-fated invasion of the Soviet Union to the failure to capture vital oil fields, the German war effort was plagued by an inability to secure the resources necessary to sustain it. The battle for fuel became a battle for survival, and in the end, the inability to secure this crucial resource contributed directly to the collapse of the Third Reich. When we consider the broader context of World War II, it is apparent that the Germans were not alone in facing fuel shortages. Every major power involved in the conflict encountered some form of resource strain. However, Germany's lack of a secure and reliable fuel supply, compounded by its strategic errors and aggressive expansionism, made it uniquely vulnerable. While the Allies also faced their own resource challenges, they were able to offset these through superior industrial capacity, effective strategic bombing campaigns, and access to reliable oil sources. The Allies' ability to disrupt German fuel supplies, combined with their own reliable access to fuel, played a major role in determining the outcome of the war. This fuel crisis was more than just a military challenge. It had significant socio-political and economic consequences for Germany. As fuel supplies dwindled, the Nazi regime's grip on its civilian population weakened, wartime production faltered, industrial capacity dropped, and everyday life for German civilians became increasingly difficult. The social and political instability created by these shortages further eroded the morale of the population. And as the war dragged on, the absence of the necessary resources for victory left the German war effort fragile and unsustainable. The history of World War II serves as a reminder of the importance of logistics, resources, and strategic planning in warfare. The fuel shortage faced by Germany is a stark example of how even the most powerful military machine can be brought to its knees by a failure to secure the resources it needs. While Germany's technological advancements were impressive, their inability to maintain control over essential resources like fuel ultimately sealed their fate. As we look back at this pivotal chapter in history, we can learn several lessons about the importance of resource security, the risks of overextending military capabilities, and the impact of strategic Germany's fuel shortage crisis was one of the key factors in their defeat, and it serves as a critical reminder of how logistics and resource management can make or break a nation at war. Thank you for joining me as we explored the significant role that fuel played in Germany's failure to win World War II. If you found this video insightful and want to see more content like this, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us to continue producing deep dives into history and other engaging topics. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.